My grandma bought her house for literally $5,000. Is that not insane?
I don't even know if you could build a decent shed for $5,000 now.
The minute my life changed was when I realized, like, when I don't owe anybody anything, that's when I have the most freedom.
I really believe that, like, most people could afford their lifestyle if they didn't have all these monthly payments in their life.
People are continuing to spend the same way that they always have. And because things are more expensive now, it's just making it way worse for people, and credit card debt's rising.
You have to be very realistic with the numbers, right? Like, math isn't going to care about your feelings. You're going to feel this if you try to make this work in a situation where it just doesn't. Why does it feel like the world is so expensive, and what should you be doing to manage your money better? Welcome back to the show, everyone. Lauren and I are back for our weekly episode where we talk all things money, from paying off debt, budgeting, investing, and all the other crazy things going on in the world of finance. Now, Lauren, I was at the grocery store the other day, and I swear it feels like the price of eggs has almost doubled in the last few months. Like, I was at Target, and a pack of 18 eggs, so like 3 rows, was like $10. And I remember a few months ago, it was like at Costco, a pack of 24, so even more eggs, was like $4.99 or $5.99. And it's crazy because to top it all off, like, I feel like between the few grocery stores that my wife and I go to, like items are constantly out of stock. And it's not just eggs, because I know there's like a whole thing going on in the egg world, but like pasta will be out of stock, like soy milk, which, you know, we're soy milk drinkers, like random things are constantly out of stock. Do you feel like you've noticed that?
I've definitely noticed the increase of like eggs in the price, as well as like them being missing. I actually was just back at the grocery store this week, and I go to Aldi, so I don't know. I know in California, you guys did not have Aldi, right?
No.
Okay.
And I don't even think they have it in Texas. They might have a few. I'm not sure.
Okay. So you've never experienced Aldi, but like Aldi's I would say it's pretty cheap as far as groceries go. And that's where we've consistently got our groceries. So I went there this week, and they did finally have the pasture raised eggs in, which they haven't had in a few weeks. So I was like, ooh, maybe this bird flu or whatever's happening is like over. But you know, of course, those are the more expensive eggs anyway, but the regular eggs were still like $5.47, which is crazy. Cause like, I feel like when I first like moved to this area, they were still like, between like $1 and $3, I'm pretty sure. So, yeah, I've definitely noticed an increase in like groceries, and over the past few years, especially. Like, I think from 2020 to now, I think groceries have went up like 23%. So if you were like average was like $100 for groceries, you're now paying like $125. And I definitely think that I've noticed that in my budget. Have you had to like change anything with your grocery budget?
Yeah, you know, I was thinking about it, and I was talking to someone on Instagram. They're, you know, trying to figure out how much they spend on groceries. And when I was thinking about it, I've noticed that we haven't necessarily changed like the number in the budget. And so for like the two of us, we spend like about $500 a month on groceries. Yeah. And like, we haven't really changed that number, but we've definitely changed our shopping habits. And so now it's like focusing on buying more bulk foods. Certain items we just like, you know, don't buy anymore because it's gotten so much more expensive. Yeah. And like kind of changed our eating habits a little bit so that it still fits within that number. But I feel like we're kind of getting close to that point where it's like, all right, we're probably going to need to bump up that grocery budget a little bit.
Yeah, we definitely have. And I think that's also because we've been buying like a lot more. Aldi has a lot of like great organic food and like grass-fed beef and stuff like that. So we've been going more of that route, like just to kind of improve the quality of food that we're eating. So we've definitely bumped our budget up. And I will say, my husband, now that we live in like the Chicago area, we have a ton of different grocery stores. He does love going to the Whole Foods to get some good quality food there. I personally still go to Aldi because I'm just like, I can't spend that much. When I go into a regular grocery store, it's overwhelming. Like Aldi's like a very small grocery store. They don't have they have like their own brands. Sometimes they'll have like on brand stuff, but mostly it's their brands, and like it's pretty small. Like there's a few selections. And if I go into a regular grocery store, I have so much anxiety because there's so many choices there. And I feel like that's how you overspend. Like I can go into a regular grocery store and just spend like crazy. I'm like, oh my gosh, like there's all this food that I don't typically see because there's just so many choices there. But yeah, so for us, like, you know, things have went up a little bit, but I do think like we're eating a little bit different, as well as going to some different stores that are definitely more expensive than like your everyday grocery store.
Yeah, I like definitely stay away from Whole Foods because I know how expensive it is. I feel like I rotate between like Target because the Good and Gather brand, like their store brand, is like pretty reasonable. And I think they mark up the prices on the other stuff to make theirs even more appealing.
Yeah.
Trader Joe's, but they're constantly out of stuff as well. And then like Costco, we try to do like all our bulk shopping at. And then it like sometimes you need to go to like a real grocery store. So we'll go to like H-E-B. But, you know, outside of groceries, do you feel like anything has like dramatically gone up in price for you?
Well, I mean, it also doesn't help, but we did move, like I said, to the Chicago area. I've said that so many times, but housing, housing has went up for us significantly. It's a much more high cost of living city compared to Pittsburgh, where we came from. So I feel like that has went up. I don't notice like the gas prices as much. However, I feel like those have been relatively the same. Like I've noticed around like $3, $3.50 for gas over the past like few years. I work from home, so I fill my tank once a month, maybe. So I feel like I don't notice that too much, but definitely like housing costs. And I'm sure we'll talk a lot about that today, but rent for us is pretty expensive compared to what we were paying for our mortgage in Pittsburgh. So that's the only thing I really think I notice. I don't know. What about you? Anything else that you've noticed?
I mean, it's funny that you mentioned that because like it's almost the opposite for us because we moved from California, which is like known for its high cost of living, its high gas prices in particular. We moved to Texas where, you know, in the Austin area, like unless you're like really in the city, housing is pretty affordable here. And so like our housing costs was like cut in half moving here, and our gas prices, almost cut in half. I'd say the gas we're paying now is like 40% cheaper than what we were paying in California. And so that's definitely made the budget a lot easier. But yeah, I mean, outside of that, like I would just say like groceries have been the number one thing, like dining out, you know, like I feel like especially since the start of COVID until now, like there's all these little surcharges to like account for increased costs for like running the business, you know, and sometimes it'll just be like, here's the price on the menu. And then at the bottom of the menu, they say, oh, we added like a 5% surcharge to everything. And I don't know, little things like that. But yeah, I would say like from moving from California to Texas, we've definitely noticed like certain categories in our budget have like, they go a lot further here. So I don't know, that's one big thing. But, you know, I feel like with like, I don't know, especially in the last year in particular, and really since the beginning of like the COVID times, like increased costs, like rising costs has been a huge topic. Like inflation's been a huge topic. And I feel like, you know, it's been 5 years now, and I feel like people still haven't come to terms with like, this is kind of just the new normal. You know, I feel like people are continuously waiting for things to stabilize a little bit. And, you know, maybe for a few months it might feel like that, but like, you know, then something else happens and boom, costs increase, you know? So I don't know. I do you feel like people are changing their spending habits accordingly, or do you feel like they're still using the same like bad spending habits that they had that maybe they could kind of afford before like this dramatic increase of prices, but now they're just really feeling the pain of that?
Yeah. And something, I just want to touch on something you said like people are waiting for the prices to like stabilize. And I don't think people are waiting for them to stabilize. I think they're waiting for them to go back down to what things were like 2018, 2019, you know? And like you said, that's not going to happen. Like, I just think this is the new world we're in. We are paying these prices. Why is a company going to reduce their costs when we're already, you know, paying for things and they're making tons of money off it, you know? So I don't think we're ever going to go back to those times. Do I wish that like the inflation could stop or just like, you know, like you said, stabilize? Yes. But, you know, that's still pretty high compared to what it was, you know, 4 or 5 years ago. As far as like what people are doing, I don't think people are paying attention enough. Like, I don't think they're just thinking, okay, or they know that prices have went up, but they're not really looking too much into it. They're continuing to live their life the same exact way that they have been. I think a lot of people don't pay attention to the expenses they have going out, where they're spending. We know this. We know that people don't really like to budget, so they're not paying attention to it. I think things might be a little easier for people if they were to pay attention to that stuff and maybe adjust some things. But I personally think that people are continuing to spend the same way that they always have. And because things are more expensive now, it's just making it way worse for people, and credit card debt's rising and things like that. And no, they're not taking into account, you know, things are up, so maybe I should pull back in this area, or I need to put my money here. It's just they're continuing to live the exact same way that they have lived. I don't know. Do you think the same thing?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think I definitely hear people like the conversation is more shifting towards like, I need to start budgeting. Yeah. And so like that, I think that's more like the forefront of their minds, but I don't think they're still like diving fully into it. Like a lot of people are stuck in that place of like, I know I need to budget. I know the things I should be doing, but I'm just not doing them yet. And and if you're kind of waiting around for prices to come down or to stabilize, like they're just not, if you just look at trends over the last 10, 20, 30 years, like prices continue to go up, and the hope is that your wages continue to go up to match that. But like when we've lived through like a period of like 3 years of heavy inflation, you're going to need a dramatic increase in your income to really bring, to really kind of stabilize things inside of your budget. Mm-hmm. And so like, if you're, I don't know, I feel like people need to really, like you said, really dig into the numbers, really get serious about it. But I think that's kind of like a perfect segue into like the first question that we had for everyone. This one's all about budgeting. So this person wrote, should I be increasing my budget with inflation? I've gotten pretty good at creating an accurate budget for my expenses. It works well for a few months, but time and time again, inflation slowly creeps in and my budget falls short. How are you keeping your budget realistic across time with rising costs? And, I think this question, it's perfect based on what we were just talking about in the beginning. But, we were talking about like certain items like eggs or whatever it is have gone up in price like pretty dramatically over the last couple of months. But like, I don't know, I'm a big believer that like, I genuinely don't think that you'll notice the increase in costs or rising inflation over the course of like 2 or 3 months. Like this is something that's easier to compare over the course of like 2 or 3 years, or even year to year. You can kind of see that big increase in prices. But like if you're creating a budget and it only works for you for the next like 2, maybe 3 months, and then you're finding yourself having to readjust, I don't know, Lauren, do you think that's truly because of inflation and increasing costs? Or do you think that might be a little bit of like lifestyle creep coming in?
Yeah, I also feel like I don't know. I like to give myself a little wiggle room in my budget too. So I don't think I would even notice a tiny bit of shift in my inflation just because of that. But yeah, I think you're right. I think it could be a little bit of like lifestyle creep there. I don't know. As far as like how we adjust like for inflation, I think because I track all of my expenses, this, Nick, because we track everything. I think I have a good pulse on like what things coming in each month and what that looks like. So if I notice like randomly one month that, maybe my groceries were more expensive that month, and I go in there, I'm like, okay, I bought an espresso coffee this month. That's why. I notice that's more of like a lifestyle thing rather than like actual, inflation. But I have noticed probably from like 2 years, probably to now, my budget for groceries has probably went up at least $100. But like I said, I've also been, eating more like organic foods and like grass-fed beef and stuff like that. So yeah.
Yeah. Which is like in one sense, like a lifestyle inflation, right? Sure. Lifestyle creep. Yeah, no, I 100% hear what you're saying. Like, I feel like over I don't think I've changed my budget for groceries in like several years now. Like $500 has just continued to work for us for at least the last 2 years. Yeah. And like I said, like we've had to make some adjustments to like, okay, like maybe we don't buy certain items anymore, or like it's kind of like a treat every once in a while. But like, no, I totally hear what you're saying. Like there are times where like, okay, like we've got like 5 or 6, like maybe a week left, and we're like pretty close to the cap on our grocery budget. And I kind of look back at my expenses. I'm like, yeah, it's probably because of that one grocery trip. Like we went all out on snacks or something, or we wanted to like do something. And that's kind of why. Yeah. But I don't know what this person's saying, like their budget really only works for a couple months. Like, I don't imagine that like over a 2 or 3 month period, like you're going to suddenly see like $50 in increased costs, which in my mind, like if you're constantly going over $50, like that's probably enough reason to increase your budget. But like, yeah, I don't know. I don't think that like over the course of that short of a time period, you're going to notice it to where you need to increase, right? You need to increase the categories in your budget. And if you're doing that multiple times a year, like year over year, like you're adding a couple $100s to your budget every single year. I don't know. I feel like even at the most, like I could like, assuming there's nothing wild that happens in your life, like you start a family, you buy a home or whatever, like assuming expenses stay relatively the same, like I'd imagine like maybe every 6 to 12 months, you're kind of checking in and seeing like, all right, do I need to revise these numbers? But any more than that, I feel like it's something more so with your spending habits as opposed to just like, saying like, oh, it's inflation, right?
Yeah. And honestly, my budget, like you said, yours hasn't changed that much. Mine's changed like very minimally, but I'm just like, I copy and paste it every single month and I don't really do too much with it. Like there's times where I'll have like, and it sort of balances itself out. So sometimes I'll have, more money left in my grocery fund. And I'll be honest, I don't spend that much on eating out. So I've been having a lot of money left over in that each month for like eating out. So I don't know. like you said, like it's just kind of stays the same. But if it's going up that rapidly, it's probably because like you've changed something else other than like inflation, or you're driving more, or you have another family member that you're feeding now, or something like that. Like something has to be changed there. I don't think it's going up that dramatically.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. Now I'm curious, like, what do you feel like, okay, like maybe you've been in the same budget or you've used the same numbers for your budget for the last couple of years. Like, I know for me, like I feel like we're getting close to the point where like maybe revising some of those numbers would be a good idea. Do you feel like there's anything that like people should look out for when they're going to adjust their budget, and the justification for it is like costs have gone up, inflation's hitting hard, like I need to adjust these numbers? Do you feel like there's like maybe pitfalls that people should try to avoid between determining if this increase, am I just justifying like lifestyle creep, or do I genuinely need to increase the cost here? Like, do you feel like there's something that people should keep an eye out for?
Well, I think that's going to depend on like your individual situation. So like for me, for example, like I wanted to increase mine so I could afford those organics and different types of, pasture raised eggs and stuff like that. But if you're really just, like, I think those are the things you have to look at. Like, okay, is it actually the price of something, or is it the lifestyle that I want to have? And I don't think it's a problem. I think you should, if you want to do that, if you want to eat those types of foods, like I definitely think you should. That's why I haven't like, shamed myself for like, for increasing our budget as far as like groceries and stuff goes. But I'm not sure if that answers your question.
No, that's good. Yeah, I feel like if someone's like constantly playing catch up and they feel like they need to adjust the numbers, like, well, like first question, like, are you actually tracking all of your expenses, right? Like, are you using the tools that you have to stay within budget? And then if you are, like, when's the last time you like reflected on your last few months of spending? Like if you're kind of just finding, at the end of every single month, like my budget's pretty tight. Like, okay, like have you actually looked at last month's budget or the last few months worth of budgets and seen like, what were the trips, the grocery trips, or like the periods of the month where like I spent a lot of money? Like maybe assessing that first before you decide like, I just need to increase my budget. It's because of inflation or whatever. And instead it might be because you need to, I don't know, maybe just practice a little bit more discipline with your spending, really make sure that you're staying on top of tracking things so that when you get close or rather, that like, okay, I need to make this money last for the rest of the month. And so if I'm halfway through the month and I've used like 80% of my budget for a certain category, like, like it's probably the way you're spending money that you need to adjust a little bit, practice a little more discipline. And that's probably going to make it a little easier towards the end of the month,
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, but I don't know. I feel like one thing I've noticed too that like can really break a person's budget is like how many monthly expenses do they have? And on one of our last episodes about like, should you finance it or should you pay cash for it? Like someone had commented about, like I'd rather just roll my new phone purchase into my bill. I can take the incentive and just pay it off monthly. And I'm like, in my mind, I'm like, dude, me and my wife, we try to avoid monthly payments whenever possible, because the less monthly payments I have, like, that means in the moment I do have to pay cash for it. And that might take a little bit out of my savings. Right. But month to month, like the less amount of monthly payments I can have, like the easier my budget is, the further that my income feels like it goes, right? And even down to like, okay, like I know if I want to max out my Roth IRA, it's going to take like $583 a month. But if in the beginning of the year, I can throw a couple $1,000s in there, like now my monthly bill for investing inside of my Roth IRA is significantly less per month, So like finding ways to like lower your monthly costs. And if that means like trying to remove all the monthly payments out of your life, I think that's one way that people can really make their budget a little easier. But I feel like too many people kind of get stuck in that world of like, like I can afford the monthly payment for this item instead of saying like, can I actually afford the item itself,
Oh my gosh. Yeah. And I think back in that episode, I said that I came across a saying that was like, stop financing consumption. Like that just should be something that we just say no to. Like, I think it is so predatory. Some of these services that offer like, what are they? What's it? Klarna and like pay later. I forget the other ones, but, even on like, you can use those services on like clothes, leggings.
Yeah.
Like, I'm sorry. You can't tell me that like, I mean, if we're using that stuff on like leggings, like I'm sure you have clothes that you can wear. We do not need to be financing every single thing we own. But yeah, I think the minute my life changed was when I realized like, when I don't owe anybody anything, that's when I have the most freedom, because it's like, there's nothing standing between me and like, if I want to quit my job or, whatever there is, or if I want to change careers and try something else, But yeah, I think we just need to get away from the monthly payment thing. But I think with inflation and the rising costs, people have become, they've kind of leaned into that a little bit more of like, okay, well, you know, this is only a little bit more per month. You know, these things are fairly cheap. You can finance your leggings for like $11 a month and you're like, oh, that's not bad. But then if you're doing this on multiple things, it's like, that's really what's adding up. And that can also be the cause of all this. Like, you know, we talked about like lifestyle creep or like rising costs. Those little payments right there can really play into that as well.
Yeah, I feel like I've seen so many, like whether it's like financial institutions or even just like retailer websites, right? Like they always offer like a buy now, pay later option. And it's for things that are like if you're doing buy now, pay later for something that's under $100, like not that it's justified if it's over 100, right? But like if it's under 100, even more so driving home the point that like, what are you doing? You know, like if you are constantly saying, can I afford the monthly payment? You get to a point where like you're maxed out on monthly payments and your budget feels so tight. And like, I don't know, I really believe that like most people could afford their lifestyle if they didn't have all these monthly payments in their life. You know, like they could afford to put money into retirement, to save some of their money, to not have to be stressed every time they go to the grocery store or whatever it is. But it's because of those monthly payments inside of their budget that they have to account for monthly, that's really what's blowing things out of the water, you know?
Yeah, definitely.
All right, taking a quick break from today's episode, Lauren and I have some exciting news we'd like to share with you. If you're feeling stuck with your finances and don't know where to start, we have you covered with our one-on-one financial coaching.
These are no strings attached coaching sessions that you can sign up for today. No ongoing commitment. You simply book a session whenever you need one.
Each call is 90 minutes, and by the end of it, you'll have a clear budget to work with and a solid plan to start paying off your debt. Plus, we'll make sure you walk away with some awesome tools to keep you on track, including our budget dashboard and expense tracker, as well as our debt payoff optimizer.
And the best part, you'll get to work with both of us on the call. Together, we'll help you develop the best possible strategy forward, answer your questions, and make sure you feel confident about managing your money.
So if you're ready to get a handle on your budget and kickstart your financial journey forward, check out the link in the show notes to book your first session.
We can't wait to get started with you. Now, back to the episode. You know, we're talking about all of these like little payments are adding up or like inflation that's happening. But I think like the biggest elephant in the room is probably housing. Compared, 5 years to now, it's went up dramatically. So question here about housing, and then we'll talk all about how the housings went up over the year, or how like rent and mortgages and things like that have went up. So let's talk about it. So this person writes, how does anyone afford a home these days? My husband and I earn $110,000 a year and expect raises. But the cost of living in Seattle feels overwhelming. Our rent is $1,600, and with fixed expenses, we pay around $3,000 monthly. We saved $15,000, but after getting pre-approved for a $400,000 FHA loan, we realized that we can't afford the upfront costs, closing costs, down payment, and real estate fees totaling around $36K. Down payment assistance options come with second loans, and lowering our budget to $300K would mean leaving the area we love. We want to start a family, but even that feels out of reach. Is anyone else struggling with this? I feel like, Nick, if you're making $110,000 combined in like a high cost of living city like Seattle, it is just not realistic anymore.
Yeah.
Like those numbers, you're able to save the $15K. That's great. But like they said, they have to, all those other fees that, all those other, costs that come into it, which a lot of people don't play out. That's what's really stopping people too. So I don't know. I think, especially now living in a high cost of living city, like I definitely see this here, and I really wonder how people afford their lives if they're not making, I would say combined at least $150 a year in some of these areas. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, you came from California, but you have to know it better than anybody. But yeah, this is, I think a lot of people are struggling with this.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I think you kind of you have to accept the reality of your situation. Yep. Like if you live in a very high cost of living city, like your income has to be there, right? Like, and look, not to bash on these people, right? Like making 100 over, 6 figures as a household, that's awesome, right? Yeah. And $15,000 saved up, that's awesome too. But like when you actually compare that to the numbers that you need to be able to afford a house like that, like things are just so different now, right? If we were talking like interest rates are at like 2 or 3%, you can get a really good rate on your mortgage. Like you could probably be close to affording that house. But now with interest rates at 7%, right? Like that house is probably, depending on how much you put down, could be like $3,000 a month. And if you're making 110, like, I don't know, that's going to take up 40, 50% of your budget right there, So I feel like people kind of have to be a little bit more realistic. And like, even like what this person said, we saved up 15, but that's not enough to cover all those costs. Like that's probably barely enough to cover their closing costs, you know?
Yep.
And then does that mean you're borrowing 95% of your against your home, right? Like you're taking out a loan for 95% of it. Like now you're paying private mortgage insurance on top of it. I don't know. There's just so many factors here. And I'm even surprised to hear that they have, you know, finding a home for $400,000 in Seattle. I mean, I don't really know what that market looks like, but my impression was that it was inside of Seattle in particular was just as expensive as most of California.
Yeah, same. I've heard the same thing, but I feel like in this situation, like what do these people do, right? Like, do you either understand that you can start a family without having to buy a house? You can just continue to rent. And honestly, you're telling me that's like you pay around $3,000 for everything. If your rent is $1,600, there's no way your housing payment's only going to be that, you know? So I feel like just, you know, if you like living there, which they say they do, you're probably just going to have to rent for right now until your like incomes start to go up. Or you move to a lower cost of living city and afford a home, right? Because like $110K in my hometown in central Pennsylvania, you're living big. Yeah. You know, like that's, I mean, I'm serious. That's probably a very high income for the area I come from. But if they're in Seattle, they're in Chicago, LA, like it's not even, you're not going to be able to get a house. And I hate that we're here, but I don't know. It just, I do feel bad because things have changed so drastically. I also think we were a little spoiled with like 2 to 3% interest rates because that was an all-time like low.
Yeah, historically low, right?
Yeah, and because they were so low, like everybody was buying houses, which was like, you know, driving up the cost of them. And now we're here and we're like, how did we get here? You know? So I don't know. It's another thing we just talked about, like are the costs ever going to go down of housing? I don't think so. I don't think we're going to be buying, been buying expensive homes for the past 5 years. And do we think there's something going to go down and your home's going to depreciate? I just don't see it happening. So this is probably our new norm, like renting, lifetime renters, or moving to a lower cost of living city or further out. Like maybe you're, I don't know how many miles outside of Seattle you need to go to have a house that you can afford. But I hate this situation, honestly.
Yeah. I mean, Washington's one of those like unique states where like you can be within proximity of a really big city, but if you're like 30, 45 minutes outside of the city, you can find things a little bit easier, right? Like in California, for example, like that's just not the case. Like if you're next to one of the major cities, even an hour outside, like prices go from $1 million to like 800,000, you know, like it's not saving you a ton of money. Right. And then like here in Austin, for example, you know, like if you're in the city, like you're looking at homes that are easily in $1 million plus, you know, like there's some neighborhoods that have multi-million-dollar homes. If you drive 20, 30 minutes outside of the city, you can find homes for $300,000-$400,000. And so it kind of gives you that range for, depending on what your income is, you kind of just have to adjust your expectations. But like, I don't know, like I hear what this person's saying, like they don't want to leave the area that they love. But I also think you have to be very realistic with the numbers, right? Like math isn't going to care about your feelings. Your budget's not going to care about your feelings. Like you're going to feel this if you try to make this work in a situation where it just doesn't. But like, try to expand like your world view a little bit, you know, like I'm sure like I've been to Seattle before. It's an awesome city. Like Washington in general, like the way it looks is just so it's a really beautiful state, right? Like same with California, beautiful state. But like we had to adjust our expectations a little bit. Like we're not going to afford $1 million home, right? Unless you're making like $300,000 a year inside of like the Bay Area, like it's just not realistic, right? And for us, I knew it was like, okay, if we could afford $1 million home, I would rather buy an investment property and then buy a primary residence, right?
Yeah.
So I think you kind of got to just be okay with adjusting those expectations, taking some time to explore a little bit and be like, all right, what are areas that we can afford? Like, what could I learn to love about these areas as well? You know? So yeah, but only $15,000 saved up for a $400,000 home. Like that's just not going to work, you know?
Yeah. But I mean, for like a couple making, you know, 110,000. So what they're each making like 55K each, like 15,000 is quite a bit of savings, you know? So I don't know. I think about that. And then I think about like the younger generations, like how, like I think about my niece, like she's like 20, I don't know, 23, 24. And I'm like, how is someone like her, like making an entry level income? How do they afford a home ever? You know, because that's something that I don't know, like unless they start saving right now and their incomes continue to like, you know, grow, I guess that would work. But it just seems like it's so far out of reach for the young people coming up. Like, you know, if you're more established in your career and, you know, these people, you know, they might be able to do this, but they might just have to wait a few more years and like try to increase their incomes. You know what I mean? Like they can probably make this happen as long as they, like she said, they continue, or whoever continue, they expect raises. If they continue to grow their income, they probably can do this. And probably now they know the numbers. So they're like, okay, I need to save up a little bit more. But I'm like, some of these younger people coming out, is it even possible at this point? I don't know, especially in these big cities. What do you think about that?
I think it's possible, but I think you're going to really have to take advantage of like being so young, using your 20s to your advantage to really get a head start in life. And at that point, I don't even know if I'd call it a head start. Like I think the new normal of where you need to be into your 20s to be able to eventually afford a home, to be able to invest enough to retire well. Like I think you got to be able to come out of college having approached college the right way, right? Like maybe you went to a state school, maybe you were working while you're in college, right? You have very minimal student loans, and the loans you do have, they're proportional to what your income is going to be. You can afford to pay them off, right? Like if you're not taking steps like that early in your 20s, like from when you're 18 to 22, it does get really hard, right? Because now you're pushing off like, okay, I'm debt free into my 30s, right? Which is still amazing, right? Yeah. But if you hit that point, like, okay, and you're saving up for a home and you're trying to invest and you're trying to get like an emergency fund saved, like there's just not enough runway for how many things you're going to want to do in the next few years. Because I feel like when people hit 30, like, all right, now if they don't already own, if they don't already have a family, like that's kind of when those questions start to come to the forefront, and they're like, all right, maybe I do want to start a family. Maybe I do want to buy a home, right? Like, and I need to get more serious about retirement. Like if you're just at that point starting to look into those things, now it suddenly becomes way unachievable, right? Like you need to be investing a heavy amount for retirement. You need to be saving a solid down payment. And then like, if you wanted to start a family or get married or whatever it is, right? Like those are all expensive things. Yeah. And if you're waiting until you're into your 30s or even 40s to like take those things seriously, like it just gets so much harder. So I don't think it's like out of reach for young people, but I think they need to like start as early as possible. And I think a big part of that is like falls onto the parents, you know, like onto the parents for educating their kids when they are young adults, like, hey, this is the way that you have to manage your finances, because things are just more expensive now, right? Like things are going to be harder for you than they were for me, right? As your parent, right? Things are going to be harder for you. And so you really need to hit the ground running into adulthood to be able to afford these things.
Yeah. I saw this, this post on Instagram, and it says being a millennial captured in one picture. So in 1999, this house was sold for $162,000. Okay. In 2023, it's back on the market. So what is that? Like 24 years later at 1.4 million. So a 760. Yeah. Like that's crazy. It says on this like little screenshot here, it says 764.2% increased. Like that's insane. But it makes me think about like being a millennial, and I am a millennial, Nick. So I understand what this is like. And also I feel like our generation, I think there's a lot of problems with millennials. Housing is one of them. We were also kind of the first sort of generation to really take on a massive amount of student loans. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of that is because a lot of, especially my parents, did not go to college. So I was first gen, didn't really understand, you know, what I was doing, and neither did they, you know? And I also think we're in this weird middle ground of like having our own kids, but also taking care of like our boomer parents, you know, boomer aging parents. So I think millennials are in a particular situation here, which all of that to say is, you know, older millennials now are they had kids, you know, and they're starting to get in through high school or whatever, starting to make these decisions. And now they're learning from the millennials, like, okay, that's probably not the way I want to go, because I see mom, dad are strapped. They're trying to take care of grandparents. They can't afford housing. They've got student loans. So I think they're trying to make better decisions. At least that's what I've kind of experienced with my niece. You know, trying to get her to understand that like being debt free and getting to that point is truly like the most powerful thing you can have, because then you aren't spending your money on student loans, your car, all this other stuff. You can actually start putting that money towards something else. So I think we're getting to a good spot. I know younger people, I don't know too many younger people, but like, I'm just saying the ones I've come across seem to be a little bit more thoughtful about their money and what they're doing with it. And I want to say it's because of this whole millennial thing thing that's happened that I just sort of explained. Does that make sense?
No, totally. And that last part that you said, I feel like there's like a very heavy split in like young people today of like, they're either really focused on like, hey, I gotta work hard to get ahead, or they're kind of like in that like the world kind of sucks mindset and like, it's too hard for me. So like, I might as well just not try. Right. Like unless I'm willing to try like at 200% worth of effort, I'm not going to get there. And so therefore like I shouldn't try, or it's not worth it for me to try. And that sucks because it sucks to see like there's a split like that, because you're going to have one group of people who like, they do put in the work for it, and like it may not get them exactly where they thought, but they're still going to end up better than if they just kind of gave up early on, you know? And it's difficult though. Like I do think like if you don't have someone who teaches you the stuff early on, like you're just at a disadvantage, and that sucks to say, but like, like that's kind of the reality of the situation. And I think we kind of got to pair that too. Like in talking about this whole like housing discussion, like people got to be willing to adjust their expectations, like I think, one thing you mentioned about like, oh, like the Instagram post you said you read about like buying that home in 1999, right? Like, I think like, a lot of people like to say like, oh, well, like, 50 years ago, like you could buy a home on like a minimum wage job, and definitely not denying that, right? Like there's a lot of truth to that, or you could have afforded to pay to college working at McDonald's or whatever. Yeah. I think one thing too is like our expectations of what we feel like is good enough, when it comes to home buying or college or buying a car or whatever it is. Like, I feel like our expectations have inflated so much as well now too, like the average home that I feel like people want to look for or want to find is like a very high end, nice home, as opposed to like, hey, like maybe you got to adjust those expectations to buying something that's more realistic that you could fix up over time, or I don't know. I feel like people don't see like the stepping stones that they have to take to get to where they want to go. They just see the big thing and say like, well, it's not fair that I can't get there, because it was easier for earlier generations, Yeah.
And I mean, also social media is not helping at all. You know what I mean? Like you're seeing all these, I even feel it like we're renting a house right now and the kitchen isn't the best. And like, sometimes I'm like, I don't want to post that picture because of this. And I'm like, this is so silly, like, because you're seeing all these kitchens that are so white and bright and like the waterfall countertops and everything. And you're just like, oh, that's not my kitchen. And, and you want more. And I totally get that. But I also think the younger generation is also seeing a lot of these like TikTokers that like, vlog their lives and make like millions, so I don't know. Yeah, you're right. I think it is split down the middle. Like some are really on track with this, others are not. But yeah, I do think the point is fair that like our parents bought homes for much cheaper, and the problem is that the wages are not matching the inflation of housing costs. So that's the biggest thing. So I think my grandma bought her house for literally $5,000. Is that not insane? $5,000. She's lived there for, I don't even know how many, 60 years.
I don't even know if you could build a decent shed for $5,000.
No, you cannot. Now. So it's just wild to me. Like I remember asking her, like she's lived there for, I'm not kidding you, probably 60, 70 years, the same house, but like $5,000. Like that's just absolutely wild to me. Like that, even back then, like that was, I mean, I'm sure that was a great amount. That was probably like, was probably a good purchase for them, but I think that's the biggest issue is like the wages are not keeping up with the inflation of the housing costs, which is really sad. But yeah, I don't think it's ever going back to how it used to be. So this is probably our new norm, and we have to figure out ways to like make it work or be lifetime renters and be okay with that. I don't know.
I mean, what you're talking about is almost the perfect segue into like the next thing I wanted to talk about, which is investing, right? Like that's kind of the one way that you can almost combat if your wages aren't keeping up with rising costs is like investing your money into things that are going to grow and appreciate over time, right? Like I feel like that's the only way that you can really combat your not only just like your dollar being devalued, but like your income not keeping up with rising costs. Yeah. And it's funny because I was talking to someone over Instagram and like, I was like, oh, like what kind of stuff are you looking for? And they're like, well, like I want to learn more about investing, but I'm not, it just doesn't feel like with how crazy the market is right now, like it declining like dramatically over the last few weeks. It just doesn't feel like now is the right time to invest. And like, I was curious to ask you, like, when you hear that, when someone says like now isn't the right time to invest, whether the market's up, down, or whatever, like, I don't know, what does that make you think?
It just makes me think that they don't have full understanding of what the market does, you know, like, and we've talked about this before, but if the market ever crashes and we're at literally like a zero, and like we have a lot more issues than like, it's basically an apocalypse at that point. Like, I don't think our economy is ever going to crash. Yes, it's going to go up and down. But for when people say that, I often just think like they're either very like risk adverse and like are very nervous about it, or they just don't fully understand it. Because if you take a really wide picture of like what the market does, it's constantly going up and down, right? Yeah. So yeah, the market sucks right now. And I don't like looking at my accounts at this point, but I'm continuing to dollar cost average and buy every single month because I know, look at all of the past times when it's been down, it goes up after that. Like, it's going to be okay. But yeah, I think a lot of people just like don't have full knowledge of it, and that's okay. But that's why they're here to learn, you know?
Yeah, no, definitely. And that's a really good point. But like, it was just funny because like like the logic is almost backwards, you know, like when people hear the market is doing well, it's like, oh, I better jump in, you know? And it's like, like, no, when the market's doing bad, in my mind, and again, this isn't exactly what anyone else should do. In my mind, when the market is doing bad, that's the perfect time to buy. Because if I'm investing, it's not because I'm trying to make a quick buck, right? It's because I know, or I at least have the belief that like what I'm investing in, it's going to continue to grow for the foreseeable future, right? Yeah. And if I truly believe that, then the market being down is just me buying at a discount, or me traveling back in time and buying, you know, for example, today, the market's down to where it was like 6 or 7 months ago. Like, if I could go back 6 or 7 months and buy more, like I absolutely would. So if that's the logic and the market's at that point now, why not buy now? You know? So like, I feel like people kind of like they get scared when the market goes down, and a lot of the like, I think if you study market psychology, you can really understand that like the market goes down, not necessarily because of course things that are happening in the economy, right? Like that's going to cause the market. It's going to impact the market, but the market I feel like is more heavily impacted by people's emotions than it is by real data. Yeah. Right. Sure. For example, if people are very fearful of the next 6 months, like the market is going to decline. And that's exactly what you're seeing now, right? Like the outlook is so uncertain, and that's exactly what the market reflects. And when people are very excited about what's going on in the world or whatever, like that's when the market goes booming, right? Yep. Obviously there are things that like administrations can do, that politicians can do, that are going to affect the market. Yeah. But I think by far, it's more heavily influenced by people's emotions and sentiments about how they feel, like their outlook on the way things are going.
Yeah. And I mean, Nick, even you and I, like understanding this and having the awareness that like, we're just going to keep doing the same thing month after month. Even I get a little anxious looking at my Fidelity account. I don't like it because I'm like, I just hit an all new high, and now I'm like, now it's down again. You know what I mean? So I feel like we can't blame them for feeling that way, but yeah, it is a lot of emotion coming back to it. Now, something you said at the beginning of this to kind of segue into this was like, you know, this investing is a good way. If you can't buy a house, like you can still, you know, build something up for yourself. And I don't know if you follow Ramit, but he is a big renting guy. Because he's always lived in like high cost of living cities where he's like, it doesn't make sense to buy here because it's cheaper to rent, and I can just invest the rest of my money that I would be putting towards a mortgage or whatever. So that is a good point that you mentioned, that you don't, if you're in a high cost of living city, it probably doesn't make sense for you to buy. You know what I mean? So you could start this and really get a good pace with your investing, even if you're not a homeowner.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring that up, because I feel like I'm so torn on that issue of like, yeah, in most places it's cheaper to rent than it is to buy, especially right now, right? And like, okay, like to give people some real numbers, like right now we're paying about $1,500 for rent where we're at, and we love where we're at. It's a great area. We're close to like all these awesome places. Yeah. And homes that we're looking at that we want to buy, like all in between the mortgage, property taxes, like insurance, all that stuff is about $2,500. So $1,000 more. And I'm looking at my budget and I'm like, okay, well, that $1,000 that I'm investing right now could just go to the mortgage, right? Yeah. Like the numbers aren't going to change really much other than that. Like in real dollars, like if I'm analyzing it, that's the difference. And it's hard to assess because I think I think in the more immediate term, right, like investing more is going to put you so far ahead. But like what happens if you get to 50, 60 years old and you still haven't purchased a home, right? Yeah. How much more, if you have a 30-year outlook until you retire, like how much more are housing prices going to increase? Or is the plan like, okay, like I'm just going to buy somewhere totally random when I'm in retirement age, right? Like maybe that's a viable option. To me, I'm so split because it's like, yeah, I could afford to invest more if I don't purchase a home. But what happens in 30 years when I want to retire and I still haven't owned a home yet, right? Like to me, that's the part that kind of throws me off, because if you get close to retirement age and you still have a mortgage, like if you still have 20 years on your mortgage or whatever, like that's when your retirement gets a lot more difficult,
Yeah. And that's a really real issue. So I feel like I'm dealing with that with one of my parents right now, because the house that they live in is like going to be paid off probably within the next 10 years. But then it's like, okay, now we have a roof to put on. I just helped my mom with a backyard project that was like $12,000. So it's like all of these things are starting to add up. So her argument is like, what do I do when this house needs windows, when this house needs a new roof? she put a roof on back in early 2000, but I mean, that's going to be coming up again. So it's like, I see both sides to that, but then I'm also like, okay, so how there's no house payment anymore. And I guess you could put that towards savings, but some of those costs are going to be so expensive that like that person's not going to be able to afford them anyway. So sometimes I'm feeling like, would it be better for her just to rent something? I mean, like I said, I'm from a very small town in Pennsylvania. Like I think that would be possible there to like rent something, and then just not have the maintenance of it. But yeah, I go back and forth between that too, because I do think about all of those things. Like if your house needs sided or, roof or anything, those are very expensive things that like, if you just have like no house payment and you don't have much coming in from retirement, like you can't afford those either, I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's tough. It's a tough situation. And like, like I said, I'm torn on it too, because like in certain areas, like it could just make sense to rent for the rest of your life. And in other areas, like it's just not going to work, right? Yeah. With the way rents increase. Mm-hmm. And I mean, ideally, like, you retire and the hope is you have like 20 to 30 years left of life in you, like if you are renting, the increase in costs over the course of 20 or 30 years is going to be pretty dramatic, know? And so maybe that works for the first 10 years of retirement, and maybe for the last 10, it doesn't, right? So it's kind of hard to gauge. Yeah. And I mean, I think that just kind of ties back to do as much as you can now to secure your retirement, to secure your future. Yeah. Yeah. And so like one thing I did want to talk about is like, I feel like, I mean, not just on our podcast, but like on social media in general, like you always hear like you need to be investing, and like people I always see in those comments, it's like, okay, but like, I know I need to invest. Like, what do I invest in? And I want to be very cautious about what I'm saying here. Like, I'm not giving you investing advice. I'm not saying this is what you should do. This is something that like I've done for me that I've really enjoyed. Like my wife and I do this for both of our retirement portfolios. Works really well for us. And if people want more information on it, it's called the Bogglehead method. It's John Bogle or Boggle. I'm not sure if I'm saying his last name right. Or it might be John or Jack. It's one of those two names. And I think one was a nickname for him. He's the inventor of, he created Vanguard, which if you are any bit familiar with investing, is one of the most popular platforms out there because of their ETFs and their index funds. But he has a method. It's basically like the lazy investor method. It's a 3-fund portfolio where you're investing in a total stock market index fund that's probably like US based, a total international market fund, and then a total bond market fund. And like Lauren said, like you kind of just pick that strategy and you stick with it, right? Like your dollar cost averaging into it every single month. Until you hit retirement age, and whether the market's going up or down, you're sticking to your strategy. And it's funny to see because in the Reddit thread for like the Bogglehead investing method, like people have been kind of going back and forth in it because like you're seeing people come out like, oh, the market's down 10% now. Like, should I be changing my strategy? It's like, you could tell the people who don't necessarily like fully believe in the strategy when times get tough, right? Like it's easy to follow strategies that are so simple like this in times where the market's doing really well. It's hard to follow strategies like this when the market's not doing as well because you start to second guess yourself, Yeah.
I was just looking up that Vanguard Total Bond Market Index Fund to see what I thought about it. That guy's name is John, but he goes by Jack. So you were not wrong on either one of those. Yeah, I was just looking this up here. Yeah, for me, like I know the stock market is very crazy right now. I I haven't messed with international too much. I need to probably based on what I've been seeing, as our markets are going down and kind of the internationals staying a little more steadier. But I just haven't messed around with it too much. I'm still just like your typical like S&P 500 is kind of where I'm at right now. As I get closer to retirement, I think I'll definitely move into some more conservative types of investments. But even with the market being down, I'm just like, I'm going to go with this. I'm going to continue to put in exactly what I'm doing, what I've been doing, and not let that affect what I'm doing as far as like, investing goes. We have to remember, what's the saying? Like any other type of sale we really like, except when the stock market's down, where we hate that sale for some reason,
No, 100%. And like, if you got years before retirement, like it's on sale right now and you might as well take advantage of it. Right. Like, and again, like everyone's got to do what they got to do. I think times like this get really like, if you're in a moment like this and you're close to retirement age, then there's some serious like change. You got to seriously look at your portfolio and see, and hopefully you've allocated your assets appropriately to where you can kind of weather, a few years of the market being down. But like, if you got plenty of time, right? Like, I don't know. I've never met an older investor who's like, oh yeah, I wish I started later, right? They always wish they started sooner. And when the market's down, it's as if you're taking yourself back months or even years at a time where you have the opportunity to invest more. But there's a very popular saying that I always love when it comes to investing and more so just like money management in general. And it's be fearful when people are greedy and be greedy when people are fearful. And so like when people have very high expectations, or I wouldn't even say expectations, when people have very positive outlooks and people are like, oh, there's nothing that could go wrong with the market, we're in a great bull run or whatever, like that's when I think you need to take a look and say, okay, am I doing everything I can to build up a solid foundation for when this ends? And then you've built up that cash reserve. And now that the markets are down, right? Like there's blood in the streets. It's like, all right, now when people are afraid, now I can be a little greedy with how I approach this situation. Now I can choose to buy into the market a little more because I took that time to save up some funds to make sure I had a solid foundation with my finances underneath me.
So Nick, we talked a lot about a lot of different things today: housing, investing, inflation, increased costs in general. So I think just to wrap up this whole episode, maybe we should talk about, the increased prices across the board, like in your life, in my life, and everybody who's listening, like what should we be doing as far as adjusting for everything we just talked about today?
No, that's a really good question. And I feel like even like, I mean, barring what's been going on in the last few months, right? Like with costs going up dramatically, like I feel like people are always like looking for like, okay, what's the next big trend or next big thing I should be doing with my finances to get ahead? And I don't know, I'm a big believer that like the tried and tested methods of managing your finances, the things that have been around forever, like those things have stuck around for so long because they just work. And there's always going to be like new trends or new things that you should be doing or like secrets that people have for how they're managing their finances. And the truth is like, most of that stuff is just like icing on the cake, right? Like it might improve you a couple percent, but the thing that's going to make up the bulk of like your stability in your finances is going to be having really solid habits in place. And so I took some time to kind of think about what those are. And I feel like in my life, like the big things for me are like following a budget that really prioritizes your goals. And so like for me and my wife, it's like, we want to buy a home soon and we want to invest as much as we can so that life gets easier as we get older. Yeah. And that's what exactly like when you look at our budget, that's exactly what it would tell you, right? Yeah. Living on less than you make, like that's always going to be a big one. Like if you're spending every single dollar you're bringing in, like there's no room to start making progress. Yeah. And like we talked about earlier, like trying to remove as many of those monthly payments out of your life as possible, because the more control you can, the more of your income you can actually keep, the more control you can have over how your life starts to look. Yeah. Staying out of debt, right? Like that's a really important one. And then the big one for us right now is like continuing to invest into assets that are just going to appreciate over time. So whether that's stocks or if you're a big believer that that's going to be like gold and silver or Bitcoin or whatever, like, whatever it is, whatever you believe is going to appreciate over time, like your belief hopefully is built off of like solid data. And so you should continue to invest in that.
Yeah. So I shouldn't buy a brand new $80,000 car.
I don't know if I will ever buy a brand new $80,000 car, but okay. I mean, Lauren, if you want to do it, you do you.
I was thinking about it. No, I'm just kidding. I'm like a Honda, tried and true. Honda, Toyota, and their luxury brands maybe someday. But I completely align with everything you said here. And I think this changed a lot. This is really how I've been living my life, everything you just said, since I started my debt-free journey. And once I realized that like life became so much better whenever I didn't owe anybody anything and I had so much more freedom with my money and with the choices I could make in my life, that's when everything changed for me. And this is what I've been doing for the past, I don't know, when I started my journey 7+ years ago. So I've been living this way. So honestly, like even when things have went up, it hasn't fluctuated that much in my life because I'm still living the same way that I've always lived, and which is within my means, staying out of debt, having all of our kind of emergency funds and sinking funds in place, and really just continuing to, live the way we have lived and not, increase lifestyle or, do anything that we're not used to. So yeah, I agree with everything you just said there.
That's a really great point. And I feel like another big thing too for people that they could do is like, just identify the things that are most important in your life. Like not everything can have the same level of importance in your life. Nope. Like it's just not going to happen. Like it's not realistic, but you're also just not going to ever practice that. Right. Like, so identify like, what are the important things? Like maybe it's making sure that you can spend money in a certain category of your budget. Okay. Prioritize that and then give yourself some like flexibility in the other areas. Yeah. And like, if you're seeing that as like, well, I just want to be able to live my life. It's like, hey, you got to adjust your expectations to the reality of the situation. And if things are tight, you got to just make adjustments, So like what I always tell people is like, identify those top 2 or 3 things that are most important for you, go all in on those, and then just be flexible with everything else, and I think if you can live your life that way, you're going to be happy with the outcome, because those things that aren't the priority, you're probably not going to care about 5-10 years down the road. And so if you didn't spend as much money on those, it's probably going to be for the best anyway.
Yeah, definitely.
All right, that wraps up today's episode. And one simple ask, if you found some value out of the things we talked about today, consider subscribing and leave a comment down below. That's really going to be the best way you can help us grow.
Yeah, and if you want to have your money question answered on the show, you can visit our website, justanothermoneypodcast.com, and click the submit a question button. And don't forget to join us for the next episode of Just Another Money Podcast. The information, opinions, and recommendations provided on this podcast are for entertainment purposes only and do not constitute professional financial advice. Any financial decisions you make based on the content of this podcast are your responsibility. We strongly recommend consulting with a licensed financial advisor or other qualified professional before making any significant financial decisions. By listening to this podcast, you acknowledge that we are not liable for any financial outcomes.